Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It is a real pleasure to share our experiences in the UK, and it has been quite a journey so far. We're not at the end of it just yet, but we hope that we have made some progress, and it will be good to share that with you today. Hopefully, my presentation is now visible to you all. Excellent, yes. So my name is Gillian Unsworth, and I work for the Government Equalities Office in the UK, which is a central part of the UK government. And we report very closely to the Prime Minister. And in fact, the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is a former Minister for Women and Equality. So I can assure you that gender equality and pay transparency will remain high on the agenda in the UK government's policies going forward. So in the UK, we have already, we've got an important difference that I thought it was important to highlight before we start off, because we have a legislative framework that differentiates between equal pay and through the gender pay gap. So equal pay refers to individuals paying a man and a woman the same, and since for the past more than 50 years it has been unlawful to pay men and women differently for work of the same or similar value. And there's an infrastructure around employment tribunals and different recourses for action if you feel that you have been paid unequally because you are a man or because you're a woman. Separate to that, and more recent, has been the identification of the gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap refers to the difference in the average pay between men and women. So it could be a national gender pay gap, and we've been measuring the national gender pay gap in the UK since the 1990s, or it can be a pay gap in an industry, so for instance in the construction industry, or it can be in individual companies. And it's in the individual companies that we have been taking action specifically in more recent years to try and rebalance the pay between men and women. So first we set out to define the problem, and we commissioned Professor Wendy Olson at Manchester University, who has created this really fascinating analysis of why it is that there is a difference between the average pay of men and women. And some of it, I think we could guess. So straight away, occupational segregation. Men and women do different types of jobs. Women are more likely to be in secretarial, more junior roles. Men are more likely to be in the senior leadership and management roles. There's also industrial segregation as well. So even if women are in more senior roles, they're often in the less well-paid industries. So in the UK, a third of the female workforce is, two-thirds of the female workforce works in health, education and retail. All three are quite low paid sectors. And so women are going to be in more junior roles in lower paid sectors. Then a quarter of the causes of the gender pay gap can be attributed to unobserved factors. And these cannot be explained. It's more that they can't be quantified. They include things like discrimination, so straightforward misogyny, sexism, saying you can't do that because you're a woman. But also there's an element of cultural norms that lead to decision making that is not entirely unconstrained. So for instance, it's the norm that in an opposite sex couple, the woman is more likely to take time out to look after children, more likely to take time out of her career to look after, to do caring responsibilities, more likely to work part-time. And all of that is down to choice, but sometimes that choice is led by cultural norms that make it easier to go with the normal choice than to be different. But by far the greatest influence on the gender pay gap, as it states here, 40% of the gender pay gap can be attributed to labour market history. And that relates to women taking more likely to work part-time, more likely to take time out of the workforce. And so that compounds over their careers to create a greater and greater difference in the difference between what men and women are paid. And that is nicely illustrated in this next graph, which I find to be a very sad graph, but so true. Again, there won't be many surprises, but it really does bring home what those differences between men and women's careers actually translates into in women's earnings. So this sets out how the gender pay gap opens up over the course of a woman's life. And sadly, it starts in late teens, early 20s. So before constraints such as childcare and elder care come along, women are already starting to manage their expectations. And we think that a lot of that is around those cultural norms that say that women will have a family, so you manage your expectations around what you're going to do, and that men will go on to be the breadwinners. But then that plays out, because you can see a peak there in early 30s when women start to take time out of the jobs market, first of all for very practical reasons, to actually give birth in many cases. But also then that leads to taking time out for maternity leave, and that can then often lead into professional downgrading and women only coming back part-time, which then is piled upon as women go throughout their career, and compounded as they reach their late 40s, when that cumulative effect of fewer hours in the workplace contributes to lower earnings, fewer opportunities, fewer chances to get those bonuses, the better paid jobs, and generally are going to be earning less than men as they reach middle age. And that's when children start to become more self-sustaining. However, women then often take on the majority of caring responsibilities for elderly parents. So as parents get older, they need extra care. Because women have already got that reduced income, are more likely to be working part-time, it's a logical decision that they're more likely to start taking on that elder care as well. And then that's further compounded. So when women reach pension age, it means that they have a much smaller pension pot to fall back on in their old age. And particularly women who are left on their own, if they're through either bereavement or divorce, can often find themselves in very difficult circumstances because of the cumulative impact of the gender pay gap. So it was these driving factors that brought about the government back in 2017 to introduce legislation to start to really galvanise action to tackle that. So in 2017, we introduced legislation, gender pay gap reporting legislation, and that requires large employers, so organisations with 250 or more employees, to publish specific data every year. And they have to publish it on their own website, as well as the UK government website. And the publishing on the UK government website has been crucial to the success of these plans. So the information that they have to produce is their overall gender pay gap, the mean and median gender bonus gap, and the mean and median elements on both of those bits of data are really important because they show different things for different companies. They also have to show the proportion of men and women who receive bonuses, as well as the proportion of men and women working at different pay quartiles. And those different pay quartiles are a really good visual display of where women and men are split across the company. So what they do is they divide all of the employees in a company into 4 different categories: the top earners at the top, the lower earners at the bottom, and put the proportion of men and women in each of those categories. And so often you will notice that there's more women in those lower quartiles and more men as they increase up through the better paid quartiles at the top. And that's a real visual display of how a company may employ a lot of women, but there's something preventing them from getting to the top of that tree. And so we encourage employers to look at that data. So reporting is not the only output from this. We don't just want them to produce some data. We want them to look at the data and work out what it is that's preventing women from progressing in their company. And so we encourage them to make an action plan, to set out what the challenges are in their company and what they're going to do about it. And one of the crucial elements, as I mentioned, is that all of this is published. So anyone, and there's a link at the end of this, the slide pack that you can access, anyone around the world can look at live data, literally moments after an employer has published it, to see what the gender pay gap is in each individual company. And this has really helped to make individual companies sit up and go, wow, we need to do something. And we saw some very live examples of this, particularly in the first year. So for example, in the first year, when in 2018, when employers were still quite new to this, still trying to work out how to calculate the data and how to publish it, there were a number of employers that were followed by various media outlets that actually ask the questions, why is your gender pay gap so big? Why does it say this in your is this accurate? And we saw some big changes to the information that employers supplied about their gender pay gap data, because they realized that this was really interesting. We also know from working with employers that their employees were a crucial audience to them too, and they didn't want to publish something that their employees made their employees feel uncomfortable and as if they had got a bad deal. And so we provided a lot of advice to employers on how to explain the data to their employees as well. And we have explanations on our own website as to what the data means and what actions employers can take in order to tackle the gender pay gap. And this is now turned into quite a business as usual process. Thankfully, after those very exciting first couple of years, we now have over 10,000 employers reporting each year. They have to report by March and for public companies, and April for private sector companies. And each year, if they fail to report on time, the Equality and Human Rights Commission will begin an investigation and bring those companies to publish their data as soon as possible. And thankfully, over the course of the past 5 years, we have actually seen a reduction in the gender pay gap in the UK, and it has now reached an all-time low of 15.4%, which is fantastic. However, it is still 15.4%, and there's still much more work that we need to do. So now that gender pay gap reporting has become a normal part of business reporting, we're focusing on what we can do to get employers to take action to close that gender pay gap. And we're also dealing with new exacerbated problems that have really come to light in a post-pandemic. So in the UK, we're struggling with skills shortages, we're struggling with talent attraction, and we're struggling with staff retention. So we have record high levels of employment, but there are still shortages in technical roles. And this is mismatched because we know that there's more women than ever coming out of school and university with higher qualifications than ever before, yet we still have great shortages of women in different sectors like the STEM sectors. So we're trying to look at those and trying to help those sectors to try and attract more women and also try to retain them in their workforces. So first of all, we are building the evidence base. Our analysts are analysing the current data around what does the workforce look like in a post-COVID economy, and we're also looking at what works to where those gaps are and what works to plug those gaps. So first of all, we have a STEM returners programme, and this came about because we recognised that in that period when women drop out of the workforce for caring responsibilities, many women who work in STEM roles often don't return to them. And that's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it is just because the work doesn't fit with the lifestyle around caring and their new life as a parent. But also a lot is to do with the fact that very technical roles, the expertise moves on. And in just the space of a year, 2 years, a woman's skill set can become out of date. And so what we're doing is we're working with employers in the STEM sector, plus women who have been working in STEM roles but have been out of them for more than a year, to try and work out what are the barriers that stop a woman from going back into those roles and making a successful career after having children, or taking time out of the workforce for whatever reason that's lasted for more than 12 months. So we will draw together all of the evidence and the learning that we get from that, and create from that a toolkit which will help more employers to make sure that they don't lose that valuable resource of these experienced women who drop out for caring reasons. We're also setting up a high growth enterprise task force to try and increase the number of women who are setting up high growth enterprises. We know that a lot of technical companies, a lot of financial companies are set up by men. We know that women only have access to around 1% of the venture capitalist funding in the UK. So we have created an amazing task force of really impressive entrepreneurs from the UK who are working out why it is there are so few of them, and trying to work out how to give women who would like to set up a high growth business an instruction manual on how to do that, but also how do we unlock that venture capital funding to make sure that women get a better share of that pot as well. We estimate that if women set up high growth businesses at the same level as men, that it could add an extra £250 billion to the economy. So this really makes sense. And so we are really keen to push that on, and we are looking to produce our findings and our outputs later in 2023. So we will look forward to sharing that with you in coming months. But then returning to the theme of pay transparency, we're also taking the next steps in pay transparency and developing a pay transparency pilot. So we're working with businesses to try and encourage more employers to include pay scales in job advertisements and stop them asking about pay history. Currently in the UK, a lot of employers will just provide a job advert that says this job includes this, we're looking for this, and they don't include the amount of pay that somebody can expect to receive. And we know from our research that women and people from minority ethnic backgrounds are disadvantaged by this. They are much less likely to negotiate a competitive pay package if they don't know what the parameters are within which they can negotiate. So we are calling for employers to add pay scales to job adverts, but we know that this isn't straightforward in many cases. So we're partnering with, we have a business working group, and we have an analytical and behavioural science team to support us that are working out why it is that employers don't include pay scales in job adverts now, and working out how to help them do that. So we're creating a methodology to make sure that employers provide accurate pay data. and also making sure that they don't inadvertently set out or appear to set out an equal pay issue whilst they're publishing their pay data. So we're looking at in a holistic way to try and get employers to take a much more methodical approach to how they calculate pay based on what the role contributes to their company, and also the value of the employees or potential employees' experience and skills to that role, to then calculate what their final pay package will be. We also know that a lot of employers at the moment calculate pay based on what somebody has earned previously. And again, we know that women are disadvantaged by this. So when a woman starts in a new role, if she's asked, what do you what were you paid in your previous role? A woman often answers truthfully, and a man maybe less so. So we know from that a company already is going to be basing what its pay calculation is on unsatisfactory information. Plus, we know, as we saw from the graph earlier, a woman is more likely to have earned less as she goes through her career as well. So a woman is automatically disadvantaged when she comes to pay negotiations, even if both a man and a woman are entirely truthful about what they earned previously, because a woman's more likely to earn less previously. So in giving employers the tools to make a more methodical calculation for their pay, we're also asking them to stop asking questions about pay history. And our aim is to sell this as something that actually makes business sense. It's not just a good thing for helping women. It's a good way for employers to understand what they pay their employees and why, and be more methodical all the way through that. But we know that we can't just say that that's a good thing to do. So part of our project is to continue to build the evidence base for UK employers to help them understand why this makes good business sense. And once we've got all of this package of tools for employers, employees, and all of that, we're going to be sharing best practice, and we will be making the most of our early adopters. We know there are a lot of companies that are interested in doing this early, and so we will be showing those off, but also encouraging them to help their business colleagues to help other companies to learn from their best practice, because we know there's only so much that government can lead the way in this, and it has to be an organic business-led discussion to make this really work for business. And again, you are our first audience too. We would love to share what we learn when we've got those materials to hand sometime over the course of next year too. So finally, as I said, there's lots of information around what we're doing on the website. I've also shared my contact details if you'd like to get in touch with me, and our Twitter and Instagram handle there as well, so you can see the latest news from the Government Equalities Office and the wider Equality Hub, because we've got new ministers and we'll be doing lots of exciting new things as we go forward. So please do get in touch if you'd like any further information. And thank you very much for listening to what we've done so far on my presentation. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Gillian. Your story was actually very exciting, but we have one question. Thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful story about the UK experience. I have a practical question. I know that your employers need to supply their data on 8 indicators. So how did you devise these 8 indicators? Thank you.
With a lot of research. So first of all, we spoke to statisticians to work out which were the best indicators to demonstrate the clearest differences in most organizations. But then we also looked to businesses to find out what data was readily available to them. So we spoke to employers to understand what information they had on payroll data, but also payroll service providers to work out how easy it was to extract that data. And by using all of that, we created these quite small measures, but quite powerful measures. But we recognize that even those can be quite complicated for employers. So we've created a lot of guidance as well on how to make the calculations. So if you look at the gender pay gap reporting website, there is guidance on how to calculate the mean and median, for instance, which a lot of people don't remember the difference from high school maths. So there's some very basic advice on how to make those calculations. But we know that they aren't a perfect measure. They're a one-size-fits-all measure. And what was critical to us was making sure that the majority of employers could make those calculations and that they would be a representative, a pretty representative number. But what we also encourage is for employers to look beneath those calculations, to do their own analysis internally to find out what that data is actually saying to them too.
I wonder if you are also working and somehow reflecting on the British enterprises and companies that are actually working abroad.
We do to a certain extent, and it's really interesting actually how the multinational companies have managed the message both in the UK and overseas. So we don't require employers to report on their employees outside of the UK, but we know that this has had a knock-on effect across the world because of course, employees of a company, for instance, Shell, I know that the Shell company created a video for their entire international workforce to explain what their UK gender pay gap data meant, because they knew that the news would travel across borders, and the information is available to everybody via our website immediately. So they managed that across their workforce, and in fact created gender pay gap data across their workforce. There's also a lot of employers with business interests in countries such as Canada, as we're about to hear from, that recognized that this was coming down the line in Canada, or for instance in Australia, whose gender pay gap reporting predated our regime by 5 years. In Australia, a lot of companies were already reporting gender pay gap data. So it's interesting how those international companies approached it with their different nationality workforces. And I think we don't have a measure, but I think it has had a knock-on effect into other countries, even where there is no requirement to do gender pay gap reporting, because it's just made it more visible, and their company's name is on a website in the UK with a measure of how much they pay men and women, and that just piques people's interest.
Thank you very much. Your story was very exciting, and thank you for joining. And we heard the situation and the experience of the UK. And I remind you that you have an opportunity to contact Gillian and to ask for more information.